Greetings, comrades. Just making sure you did not forget why we're here. Russian Conspiracy Iceberg, level 4, crazy stories, all that. So what's on the menu today? How about a story of the Soviet nuclear research specialist who mysteriously vanished in Spain? Or an experiment on the crossbreeding between man and monkeys? Or maybe you'll be amused by the theory that Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space. Let's find out. Traitor Nations. On February 23rd and March 8th, 1944, the NKVD carried out special operations in the Kabardino-Balkar and Chechen-Ingush autonomous republics. Departmental troops forcibly evicted almost all Balkars, Ingush and Chechens from the North Caucasus to Central Asia, almost 650,000 people. The eviction of 3 ethnic groups was part of the so-called Great Migration of Peoples during the Great Patriotic War. It was then that the idea of Traitor Nations was formed. The idea that there are certain ethnic groups within the USSR that are ready to stab it in the back and go over to the enemy's side at the slightest opportunity, or that they actually did it, joining Hitler's troops. However, this relocation began early as the 1930s. The authorities became suspicious of diasporas living near the state border. Poles, Germans and Finns in the western regions of the RSFSR and Ukraine, Koreans and Chinese in the Far East. In the North Caucasus there were 5 such peoples. Kalmyks, Karachais, Balkars, Chechens and Ingush were considered as peoples who did not embrace the Soviet order, were still committed to religion and national customs. It was assumed that with the outbreak of the anticipated Great War, they would become a 5th column of the potential enemy. Formerly, the deportees were considered free special resettlers, not prisoners. But in fact, the conditions of their resettlement were, to put it mildly, difficult. According to some reports, from 10 to 20% of the resettled could not survive the first winter in the new place. The main place of expulsion was Kazakhstan, where the locals were also not very happy with their new neighbors. After Khrushchev came to power, these peoples were rehabilitated and allowed to return to their homeland. So, were there collaborators among the representatives of these ethnic groups? Yes. Was the percentage for these groups higher than for others? Debatable, but maybe. Is this enough to deprive an entire people of their homeland, abandoning them with their children and elderly in a deserted cold steppe? Of course not. Kirov's murder. Sergei Kirov was one of the prominent figures of the revolution, a member of the Politburo, the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks. His assassination on December 1, 1934 is considered by most historians to be the trigger for the beginning of mass repression in the USSR. Naturally, because of this, the assassination was surrounded by many conspiracy theories. According to the official version, Kirov was shot in the back of the head by Leonid Nikolaev near his office. A month later, the military collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR recognized that Kirov's murder was committed by the underground terrorist Zinoviev organization, and all those involved, 14 people, were shot. In April 1956, the Presidium of the CPSU Central Committee decided to establish a commission to verify the circumstances of Kirov's assassination. And 6 different commissions came to the conclusion that there was no underground Trotskyist Zinoviev terrorist organization in Leningrad, and the members of the former opposition, including the persons convicted in the Nikolaev case, were not involved in the murder of Kirov. Subsequently, 13 participants in the Kirov assassination were rehabilitated. Then, what was it? There are 3 main theories. The first, Leonid Nikolaev's wife, Milda Drauli, was Kirov's mistress, and the jealous husband decided to take revenge on the high-ranking politician. The second version was voiced by Nikita Khrushchev. In his memoirs, he claimed that Kirov's murder was organized by Stalin and the NKVD of the USSR. And many historians agree that the shot at Kirov was very useful for Stalin. It allowed him to unleash the most brutal purges in his inner circle and in the entire country with almost no resistance, and fully establish his dictatorship. However, there is no material evidence of this. The only suspicious detail is that Nikolaev was detained several times by NKVD officers during the preparation of the murder, but each time he was somehow released when he showed them his party ticket and weapons permit. Finally, the third version is found in the diary of Nikolaev himself, that was declassified on December 1st, 2009. According to the entries in it, Nikolaev decided to take revenge on Kirov for his dismissal from the Institute of Party History, after which he became unemployed. Nikolaev compared himself to Andrei Zhelyabov, who assassinated Alexander II. It all seems rather trivial. However, in theory, Stalin could have known about the impending assassination attempt and simply not prevent it. Vladimir Aleksandrov. Vladimir Aleksandrov was a Soviet mathematical scientist, physicist and climatologist, a specialist in gas and plasma dynamics and co-author of the mathematical model of nuclear winter. He was one of the first to calculate the consequences of a nuclear war between the USSR and the USA, and the first to predict catastrophic long-term post-effects for the planet and imminent doom for mankind. In his opinion, the biosphere of the Earth after a nuclear war would change so much that it would exclude the possibility of human life on Earth. He disappeared in April 1985 in Córdoba, Spain, during a business trip to an international conference, and his fate has remained unknown for more than 30 years. He walked to the hotel and disappeared. All his personal belongings and a large sum of money were left in the room. Alexandrov's work on supercomputers on the problem of nuclear winter is believed to have placed both the USSR and the US in an equally awkward position. The USSR authorities blamed the US for his disappearance, the US authorities blamed the KGB. Most of his acquaintances believed that he had been murdered. There were speculations that the scientist had escaped. The foreign press ran stories about how Alexandrov enjoyed a trouble-free life in the US, and he was delighted with hamburgers. Others, on the contrary, believed that rather he could have been kidnapped in order to further use his brilliant mind to model various situations. What really happened, perhaps we will find out someday. Abramova's Crypt. Mostly a sad story. Valentina Pavlovna Abramova, a 67-year-old music teacher, died during Yeltsin's first term, and she was buried at the end of Putin's second term. The woman's body could not be buried for 13 years. That's how long her mummy was laying in her apartment. Abramova's Crypt is her own Khrushchevka apartment. They found it, by the way, quite by accident. The authorities thought the apartment was empty and wanted to give it to pensioners whose house had burned down. During her lifetime, Valentina Pavlovna led an isolated life. She had no relatives, no one congratulated her on her birthday, no one inquired about her health, and her neighbors did not know her name. Not surprisingly, no one noticed her departure, not even those who were obliged by duty to contact the pensioner. Letter carriers, district police officer, housing and utilities employees, social services. In response to all questions about the empty apartment, the neighbors said, "A woman used to live there a long time ago, but then she left like 10 years ago." On March 25, 2008, the Housing and Utilities Department workers called the police and in their presence opened the apartment. In the only room on the sofa there was a mummy-like corpse of a woman. On the floor there was a pile of newspapers and magazines dated mid-90s. Actually, even the exact date of death could not be established. Somewhere in the late winter of 1995. The most recent of the newspapers was dated January 25th. All neighbors who were later visited by journalists said one thing: Valentina Pavlovna had only herself to blame. She was unfriendly, never said hello to anyone, and if she saw someone, she tried to enter the apartment and close herself off as soon as possible. Neighbors are still sure that if she had been an open person and sat with babushkas on the bench, if she had come to them for salt and matches, of course they would have asked where Abramova had disappeared for 13 years. And the worst thing about this story is that there are probably hundreds of such Valentinas Abramovas. FSIN Leaks. A few years ago, human rights activists from the Gulagu.net project reported that they got the largest archive of prison torture videos filmed in Russia. According to project founder Vladimir Asechkin, foreign agent, 40 gigabytes of prisoner torture videos were taken by officers of the Russian Federal Penitentiary Service, FSIN, on their official video recorders. After several shocking videos from the archive were published, the FSIN, the Prosecutor General's Office and the Investigative Committee of Russia launched investigations, and Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov called for establishing the authenticity of these materials. I'll tell you right away, the videos from this archive are deeply disgusting. And the conspiracy in this case is not about whether or not there is torture in Russian prisons. It's about who, how and why collected all this dirt on themselves and then handed over this archive. According to Osechkin's own version, the archive was given to him by a former inmate who somehow got behind the computer inside the prison and gained access to the materials. However, there are materials from various prisons from different parts of the country inside this archive. It is not very believable that a simple prisoner could have access to them. Therefore, there are various versions, up to the fact that Osechkin himself is an agent of special services, and the material leaked to him is necessary for some internal political games, either to intimidate potential political prisoners or to eliminate some high-ranking rivals from the Federal Penitentiary Service. Perimeter. The perimeter system, also known as the Dead Hand, is a complex of automated control of a massive retaliatory nuclear strike created in the USSR at the height of the Cold War and used by Russia. Its details are, of course, deeply classified, but the very essence of this system is to make the likely adversary aware of its existence and think twice before making radical moves. For example, in December 2011, the existence and continued operation of Perimeter was openly confirmed to Komsomolskaya Pravda by Sergei Karakayev, then commander of the Russian Strategic Missile Forces. As far as we can tell, the Perimeter system is a backup system of coded communication between military facilities and ships equipped with nuclear weapons, and a special very powerful transmitter. When the time comes, this transmitter must signal all terminals to use special munitions according to predetermined plans and targets. What are these targets? What is the trigger? Who is the transmitter? Unknown. Many believe that the transmitter is the famous The Baza or UVB-76. Whether this is true or not, hopefully we will never have the chance to find out. Fyodor Kuzmich. Fyodor Kuzmich is an elder who lived in Siberia in the 19th century. According to legends, he was the Russian Emperor Alexander I who faked his death and became a wanderer. More in this video. Punitive Psychiatry. Punitive Psychiatry is a concept from the times of the USSR. In the Soviet Union, there was a network of psychiatric hospitals where enemies of Soviet power were placed and kept there by all methods without a proper diagnosis. One of the first examples of psychiatry being used for political purposes was Konstantin Pyats, the first president of Estonia. In 1942, he was sent to the Kazan prison psychiatric hospital for forced treatment. The diagnosis claims to be the president of the country. Subsequently, he was transferred from one clinic to another, and in 1956 he died in a psychiatric hospital in the Tver region. Another such institution was the Leningrad Special Psychiatric Hospital. In 1953, historian and bibliographer Sergei Pisarev, who had criticized the repression of doctors shortly before Stalin's death, was sent there. The man was diagnosed with schizophrenia, accused of anti-Soviet propaganda and slander. From 1949 to 1950, Alexander Yesenin-Volpin, a mathematician and son of poet Sergei Yesenin, was kept in a mental hospital. He was also accused of anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda and was declared insane. The mechanisms of punitive psychiatry in the USSR came into full force in the 1960s and 1980s against dissidents. Citizens were most often tried under Article 70 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR. Anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, and placed in mental hospitals from which it was extremely difficult to escape. In addition, human rights activists, religious figures, representatives of nationalist movements and those trying to emigrate were subjected to forced treatment. Most often people were diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia or obsessive paranoid personality development, the formation of a system of overvalued ideas with which inadequate behavior is usually associated. In 1964, after a high-profile trial, the authorities sent Joseph Brodsky to a mental hospital for 3 weeks. They tried to treat the Nobel laureate by wrapping him in a sheet and putting him in a bathtub with cold water, and then pulling him out. They also used intramuscular injections with purified sulfur solution. Abuse of psychiatry declined drastically only in the 1980s, when perestroika came to the country. More than 1 million people were taken off the psychiatric register. Death of a Pioneer Girl. The poem Death of a Pioneer Girl, written by Soviet poet Eduard Bagridsky, was inspired by a real story. The death of a 13-year-old Valentina Dyko in the hospital from scarlet fever. She was the daughter of Bagridsky's landlords, from whom he rented a room in Kuntsevo. He decided to create a posthumous poem dedicated to Valia. The center of the plot was that next to the dying pioneer was her mother, who in despair asked Valia to wear a cross, but she, as a true pioneer, refused. In the end, the girl did not cross herself before she died, but gave the pioneer salute. The poem Death of a Pioneer Girl was in a compulsory program of secondary school until 2010, and was the source of many nightmares for school children. There are many mystical rumors about the poem. First, Eduard Bagridsky himself died of asthma a year and a half after the publication of Death of a Pioneer Girl. A number of researchers see some neo-pagan motifs, worship of the elements in this work. The text itself is also quite creepy. There are lines about the bleeding earth, youth rising from the bones, and about the dead crowd opening its eyes. Finally, there was an urban legend among school children in the USSR that the poem Death of a Pioneer Girl contained the text of a spell. The poem must never be read aloud, otherwise you could invoke death. Escape from the MSU High Rise. The MSU building is one of the legendary Seven Sisters of Moscow, Stalinist skyscrapers built to capture the greatness of the Soviet country. Of all of them, the MSU building is the tallest, 240 meters high. Naturally, it is surrounded by many urban legends. One of the most famous is the escape from the construction site on a homemade airplane. During the construction of the high-rise, the labor of Gulag prisoners was used. When more than 22 floors were built, it was decided not to leave the builders up and down, but to let the prisoners live on the 22nd floor. According to legend, one of the prisoners turned out to be an aircraft designer and decided to make a daring escape. Other prisoners helped him deliver materials, laths, plywood, tarpaulin to the top floor of the building under construction. There he made an airplane out of improvised means and flew away from there across the Moskva River. Some say that he was shot in the air, others say that after landing he quickly disappeared and neither the police nor the KGB found him. The third version says that he broke his leg and was caught by the NKVD and brought directly to Stalin, who admired the talent of the aircraft designer and gave him a position in one of the country's secret design bureaus. Slavic-Aryan Vedas. Slavic-Aryan Vedas are the sacred texts of the new religious movement of Ingleism, one of the directions of Slavic neo-paganism. The adherents of the movement think they are a translation of the ancient Slavic-Aryan sacred writings written in runes on gold plates, the oldest parts of which, according to the doctrine, were created 40,000 years ago. They allegedly contain a brief overview of the entire history of mankind. It's classic, really. Different races are aliens from different galaxies, Slavs and Aryans are the first people on Earth who inhabited the distant northern lands and were very developed, blah blah blah. But most importantly, Slavs and Aryans have long fought against the grey reptiloids, the Jews. Yes, my favorite Russos vs. Lizards originated as a parody on Ingleism and the Slavic-Aryan Vedas. By the way, in 2015, the Vedas were recognized as an extremist material in the Russian Federation by a court decision. Gold of Polubotok. This is the third or fourth story in this iceberg about a mountain of gold that has been lying somewhere since time immemorial. More precisely, this time is a sort of known where. and this time it allegedly belongs to Hetman Pavel Polubotok. He left it somewhere in Britain right before his arrest in 1723. In his will, Polubotok allegedly bequeathed 80% of the gold to the future of independent Ukraine and the rest to his legal successors. The first rumors about the Hetman's untold riches appeared in the 1860s. In the 1907, the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Empire even issued an official warrant of investigation to the consulate in London. According to some reports, we are talking about 20 trillion pounds sterling in modern terms. That is about 3-4 annual budget of the United States. There is some evidence that official representatives of the USSR up to the collapse of the state and then representatives of Ukraine negotiated with the UK on the return of the gold of Polubotok. However, no documentary evidence of the existence of the gold reserve itself has been found so far. Object 825. Perhaps the most secret hydraulic engineering structure of the Soviet Union is Object 825 GTS. It is a former underground submarine base located in Balaklava, Crimea. It was built by Stalin's personal order inside Mount Tavros and is a giant underground bunker that could shelter an entire submarine fleet. In the event of a nuclear attack, the facility could shelter 3,000 people, and the nuclear arsenal was also stored there in case of a retaliatory strike. Naturally, all this was built in the strictest secrecy. The inhabitants of Crimea did not suspect that they have a huge underground city under their feet, and that there is a nuclear arsenal stored there, capable of leveling the entire peninsula. But sometimes even such secrets come to light. Now this bunker has been turned into a museum complex, and anyone can visit it. Kikimora House. A local urban legend of Perm. The house with the Kikimora is an unfinished and subsequently demolished 19th century building, the house of landowner Yelysey Leontievich Chadin, which was supposedly haunted by a mysterious Kikimora. Supernatural phenomena in this building are associated with the use of gravestones in its construction. They were used because the owner was very greedy and saved money on everything. Actually, Chadin himself barely had time to move into the house. He died there and it quickly became empty. And then the neighbors began to notice strange phenomena. At night, voices were heard from the abandoned building. The clinking of breaking dishes, knocks, groans, and heavy footsteps. Folk rumor quickly found an explanation for this. The spirits of the dead came to the house in search of their gravestones. The fire of 1842 provoked new rumors. After all, then the entire neighborhood burned down, but by some miracle this house survived. According to an old woman who was passing by during the fire, she saw a strange-looking figure leaning out of the window and waving the fire away from the building with a handkerchief. Thus was born a new legend about the Kikimora, the lord of local ghosts. In the 1880s, the house was demolished and in its place was built a women's gymnasium. But according to the rumors, the ghosts did not leave the beloved place and still walk the corridors of the new building. Sukhumi Experiment. Sukhumi Monkey Nursery is a real place. Officially, it was created in the USSR for the purpose of experiments on primates to study human diseases. Today it attracts tourists not only by the presence of monkeys, but also by the fact that there were allegedly serious experiments on obtaining a human-monkey hybrid conducted there. Such a being was to be the ideal builder of communism, a perfectly manageable worker, peasant or soldier, unburdened by superfluous thoughts. The author of this idea was 56-year-old professor of medicine Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, who had been working in France for a long time. Back in 1910, Ivanov made a report at an international congress, proving that crossbreeding a monkey with a human being was a feasible task. He conducted the first such experiments in Africa, in French Guinea, but there, so to speak, the results were not achieved. We also don't really know how exactly the experiments were conducted, but according to his own memoirs, Ivanov decided that it will be incomparably easier to find women willing to be subjected to the experience in Europe than in Africa. It is enough to have 2-3 adult male anthropomorphic monkeys for this kind of experiments. As a result, Ivanov's charges, together with the experimenter, ended up in Sukhumi, where he wanted to continue his experiments. And here's where the data diverge. Some claim that all of the man's monkeys died during transportation and he did not have time to resume the experiments. Others, on the contrary, claim that in Abkhazia Ivanov continued with the same scheme. Here's an advertisement from the newspaper Sovetskaya Abkhazia of May 18, 1930. Women volunteers are invited who are ready to participate in experiments on crossbreeding with a monkey. At the same time, it is stipulated those ideologically motivated, not financially. It is said that the call was answered. Volunteers of both sexes came, all for the sake of science and the enlightenment of their religiously ignorant fellow citizens. After all, the professor's goal was to prove Darwin's theory in such an unusual way. It ended, of course, in failure. The experiment was stopped, Ivanov himself was accused of espionage and exiled to Alma-Ata, where he died. But the book of the Belgian cryptozoologist Bernard Evelmans provides another option. Allegedly, Ilya Ivanov did not die, and already in the 1950s continued to work successfully in one of the Gulag Sharashki, where he managed to create a hybrid of monkey and man. According to Bernard, these tall, hairy creatures were used in Soviet mines. Zelensky is a Kremlin agent. I don't want to go deep into political conspiracies, but had to mention it. The theory here is that the current president of Ukraine had a long and successful career as an actor and showman on Russian TV, and was recruited by the Kremlin around that time. He then traveled to Ukraine, where he built a dizzying political career and became president. But he is still an agent of the Kremlin, a deep-cover Kremlin agent, and his goal is to ultimately ruin Ukraine, divide its resources between the US and Russia, and bankrupt Europe at the same time. The second option is that Zelensky was an agent of the Kremlin and was supposed to do all this, but then for some reason changed his mind. Who knows? Novocherkassk 62. The Novocherkassk shooting was an anti-Soviet riot that took place in 1962 in Rostov Oblast. A demonstration of many thousands of factory workers and citizens who joined them and came to the administration building demanding lower food prices was gunned down by KGB, army and police forces on the personal orders of Khrushchev. According to official figures, 24 people were killed and more than 70 wounded. About 100 more people were arrested and sentenced to various terms, up to and including execution. Information about the Novocherkassk events in the USSR was classified by decision of the Presidium of the USSR. So much so that even the relatives of the murdered were told, "Why did you come here? There was no shooting here, go away." The dead were then buried in different cemeteries of Rostov region, and relatives were not informed about the place of burial. But naturally, the information leaked out and formed a lot of rumors. Russians learned the truth about the events of Novocherkassk only in the early 1990s, and there are still debates about who exactly was shooting at the crowd. For example, Major General of Justice Yuri Gagarin, who investigated the case in the 1990s, believed that the military had only blank cartridges, and that the blood of the victims of the tragedy may lie on the hands of the employees of the 9th KGB Directorate, who were responsible for the security of high-ranking party and government officials. Allegedly, they shot at the crowd from above. There were even witnesses who saw people in civilian clothes and with Dragunov sniper rifles coming out of the city committee building after the shooting. At the same time, there were many injuries to limbs. Therefore, Bagrayev had the impression that the people were not intended to be killed, but simply maimed. They wanted to punish them in this way. Basayev was a GRU agent. If Zelensky can be an agent, why not Shamil Basayev too? The Chechen field commander, the organizer of the bloodiest terrorist acts in the history of the North Caucasus, who was once officially designated as terrorist number 1 in Russia. The version that the Chechen terrorist leader was closely connected with the GRU was put forward in the 1990s by many politicians and ex-members of the army and special services. Some even said that he was an officer of the GRU and he was trained specifically for operations in the Georgian-Abkhazian War, where Chechen formations fought on the side of Abkhazians. Basayev himself even received the star Hero of Abkhazia from Abkhazian President Vladislav Radzinba, and then Basayev for some reason decided to turn against Russia. Moreover, in 2020, former head of the Russian Federal Security Service, Sergei Stepashin, in one of his interviews called Basayev a professional terrorist, but admitted that apparently some of our comrades at that time, in 1992, worked with him, but not the FSB or the FSK. The Chechen terrorist himself and his supporters repeatedly rejected this version and called it a deliberate attempt to discredit Basayev in the eyes of his supporters. Gagarin hasn't been to space. There are several conspiracy theories associated with Yuri Gagarin. This one is that his flight into space never happened. This version appeared immediately in 1961. The fact that the USSR refused to publish the technical details of Gagarin's flight, there was no media, even Soviet media at the launch site, and therefore there was an immediate suspicion that the flight was faked. At the same time, the US authorities did not doubt Gagarin's flight thanks to their own objective control data. They intercepted the Vostok 1 ship's communications with Baikonur, but they did not prevent the theory from spreading. Actually, it is widespread even in our time. What are the arguments? First, many documents concerning the flight are still classified. Second, the footage of the flight preparation is a late reconstruction. The original footage has allegedly not been released yet. Third, there is not a single photo from space made by Gagarin himself. Fourth, the oddities with the landing. Yuri Gagarin landed outside the descent vehicle with a parachute. Maybe it was done to fake the flight itself, and Gagarin was simply thrown off the plane. Finally, some believe that cosmonaut Vladimir Ilyushin was the first person in space, but their flight was unsuccessful. Ilyushin himself, after his flight and landing, looked so bad that he was replaced by Gagarin, who was then eliminated in a plane crash to cover up this falsification. Young trees of Siberia. I already touched on this theory in the very first episode. The suspiciously low average age of trees in the vast forests of Siberia. It is claimed that practically all trees taken in different points of Russia are not older than 150 years. While in other places on Earth there are trees that are well over 1,000 years old. Just think of sequoias. Why are they not preserved in the taiga? Where are all the trees older than 200 years? Moreover, rare old photos from the development of Siberia often do not show any forests at all. So we have the fact that the forest rose simultaneously on a huge territory, and it turns out that there were no trees on this territory before the 19th century. Or what event could have happened to destroy so many forests? Various versions are given as the reason for this state of affairs, such as an asteroid attack, nuclear bombing, some serious climate change, etc. The official version claims that forests do not live to their maturity because of periodic fires that occur here and there throughout Siberia. But that's so boring. Katyn. The Katyn massacre is a mass murder of Polish citizens, mostly captured officers of the Polish army, carried out in the early 1940s, mostly in the Katyn forest in Smolensk region. The question is, by whom? For more than 50 years, the official view of the Soviet Union was that the Polish citizens were shot in Katyn in the fall of 1941 by German occupation troops. Only in 1990, already after Perestroika, the USSR authorities issued a statement that the identified archival materials in their totality allow us to conclude that Beria, Merkulov and their associates were directly responsible for the atrocities in the Katyn forest. That is, they put the responsibility on the NKVD and then handed over to Poland a package of previously classified documents on the tragedy called Package Number 1. On November 26, 2010, the Russian State Duma adopted a statement on the Katyn tragedy and its victims, in which it acknowledged that the mass shooting of Polish citizens at Katyn was carried out on the direct orders of Stalin and other Soviet leaders, and was a crime of the Stalinist regime. Nevertheless, there are still historians who adhere to the Soviet version of events. In their opinion, the key documents of the Katyn case, Package Number 1, are falsified in order to distort the role of Joseph Stalin and the USSR in the history of the 20th century. Moreover, recently the FSB periodically declassifies new documents that allegedly show that German-made shell casings were found at the site of the execution, or that the hands of the shot Polish officers were tied with paper twine, which was not produced in the USSR and was of foreign origin, and finally that the burials themselves were found in 1943, when the territory was occupied by the Germans. But frankly speaking, it all sounds like political statements. Thanks for watching. I received very positive feedback after the last episode, but we need more views, so please leave a like, comment, share with your friends, you know the drill. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Simon Berze, Jimmy Albin, Petr Illich and Marina Holiday. See you guys next time.